Omuuonge Uozombuze.
Amaba, hoasa.
All right, as I mentioned earlier on this afternoon, we're going to have some presentations. Aubrey is going to present on co-creation in the digital age. And of course, Selena and George are also going to lead a discussion on using WhatsApp as a training tool. Aubrey is MISA Malawi's National Director, and he has been with the organization for quite some time. He has led or championed a number of MISA Malawi projects, including the one on journalism education. So he's quite experienced on this particular subject. Under his leadership, MISA Malawi partnered DW Academy to offer training in a number of areas in which gaps had been identified. Previously, Aubrey worked as a journalist at Times Publications, the oldest print media house in Malawi. So Aubrey, the floor is yours.
Okay, beautiful, thanks. So as I said earlier on, I'll talk about co-creation and collaboration in a digital age for media sustainability. And to do that, I'll look at three key things. One, just a brief background on the media landscape in Malawi, and then look at media sustainability as a second key element, and finally, a bit of conclusion. So when you look at the Malawi media landscape, you will notice two important things. One is the growth of the sector itself from a single radio station and 2 newspapers to over 104 outlets to date. So that was around 1990s when we only had 1 radio station and 1 newspaper. Fast forward to 2020, we've got over 104 outlets. And breaking this down, you have about 46 community radio stations, and that's 24 geographical and 22 community of interest. And then we've got about 11 print media outlets with 2 dailies and 1 community radio station. The second most important thing is the birth of institutions of higher learning offering courses in journalism and mass communication. Now, there are a number of things that come to mind when you look at those 2 key developments. One is that citizens now have a wider choice, have options. They can choose what outlets to listen to, what newspaper to read, etc. And secondly, the increase also puts pressure on the outlets to be a bit more professional, creative, and to also maintain the market share. If they're not professional, if they're not creative, they would lose that market share. Thirdly, is that the growth in the media outlets has kind of put a demand on institutions of higher learning to come up with journalists to work for those institutions. But with that said, what has been the impact of COVID-19 on journalism practice, training, and what lessons can we learn from the pandemic to ensure media sustainability? There are a number of key things that came to our attention as MISA Malawi during the peak of the pandemic. I'll highlight a few of them. One, which was across the board, was the closure of journalism training institutions. And this was at a time when journalists actually required specialized training on the pandemic to report from a more informed view. And the pandemic also cast the spotlight on online education as a necessity and not an option. Thirdly, we got reports that some institutions actually started offering training online, but lacked the skills and expertise to deliver or handle online trainings. Coming down to media outlets, there was a massive reduction in revenue generation for most outlets. And I remember Mr. Ntonga actually, alluded to this during his presentation yesterday. And we also had reports of reduction in staff from most institutions laying off staff due to COVID-19. And reports of actually reduction in salaries. People were given a choice. We should cut your salary or you should go home. and people ended up, some of them having their salaries slashed so that they maintained their jobs. And other journalists actually worked without pay for months, And finally, which is something that Mr. Ntonga also touched on yesterday, is the shortage of raw materials for newsprint. I remember yesterday he was talking about the lockdown in South Africa, the lockdown in Zimbabwe, and how those lockdowns affected raw materials for newsprint in Malawi. But it was not only about newsprint, it was also about broadcasting equipment. People could not import broadcasting equipment to survive. So all these challenges, in our view, have an impact on media sustainability. Fortunately, we did not receive any reports that such a media outlet closed due to COVID-19. But what we should remember also is that in terms of the figures were a little bit lower in Malawi compared to other countries. Now we can only imagine what the situation would have been like if the COVID cases were super high. Probably would have had closes in media outlets. I'll go to the second part of my presentation, which is media sustainability, co-creation and collaboration. Now, when we talk about media sustainability, I know there are a number of things that come to mind, but a cross-cutting element is the media's capacity to operate effectively under sound political, legal, and economic conditions. In a sustainable environment, in our view, journalists will be able to operate in a professional way without interference of fear, and media organizations such as MISA would enjoy stable legal environment in terms of our advocacy. And for the Media Council, for example, would be able to discourage media corruption and promote sector-wide integrity. That's a preferred environment. Now, three things come to mind with that said. One is relevance of media content to the needs of the people. That is a very important element when you talk about media sustainability. Is the content relevant to the needs of the people that you serve? Is it relevant to your audience? And secondly, is the issue of innovation. Here, I'm referring to the ability to adapt, to change, and find innovative ways of operating in a fast-changing environment, including ways of raising resources. I remember, again, Mr. Ntonga talked about this yesterday when he was talking about their shift in policy, looking at digital first, and also talking about how they are now coming up with ways of raising resources using their digital platforms. And thirdly is the element of skills and expertise to remain relevant in a fast-changing world. I remember at some point he actually invited Selena to come in when he was talking about their creative ways of raising resources using digital platforms. Now, as MISA Malawi, we believe that one of the best ways to ensure media sustainability is to actually focus on quality journalism education. And continuous knowledge, in this case, in our view, is able to build media practitioners who are flexible, innovative, and hands-on to adapt and remain relevant in a fast-changing world. And what have we been doing to partly contribute to media sustainability as a chapter? So we've been organizing trainings to improve journalism standards for the past 15 years. We have also been giving out awards to outstanding journalists as one way of promoting excellency and specialization in the sector. But these efforts were kind of, we're not systematic enough and we're not consistent. We'd only organize the training, when we partner certain individuals that have seen some gaps in the sector, without those gaps necessarily, coming from our end. And it was also difficult to kind of sustain those trainings in a more consistent way. So we decided to start developing modules which would address the gaps that we've been experiencing. Now, these modules are systematic in their approach. They provide a framework for delivery of content, and they're also consistent regardless of a trainer. Even if we were to swap a trainer today, they would use the same content and be able to achieve our objectives at the end of the day. Now, MISA Malawi has 6 modules designed for a physical training setup as well as an online setting. We've got what we call voter-centered elections reporting module, essential public communication skills module, essential journalism skills module, and digital storytelling, which actually has two versions, a physical setup module, a version, and a WhatsApp version. And we also have investigative journalism module, which is also for both a physical setting and an online setting. How did we develop these modules? So that's where now the issue of co-creation and collaboration come in, because we've been producing or developing these modules through what I would consider a collaborative effort. So we pull expertise together to develop the modules. Trainers from Malawi, Germany, and Zimbabwe worked together to develop relevant content to share with upcoming journalists. These trainers jointly work on the modules and pilot and refine them through what I call a consultative process. After learning from the pilot phase, they would revise them, to make sure that they address the issues on the ground. And we continue to do this during the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic. All the online modules, the two modules that I talked about, were produced virtually by Malawian trainers and international trainers. And they were also piloted virtually. So we're able to adapt and adjust to make sure that we remain relevant. So apart from network problems, especially for the online trainings, I would argue that we have been able to adapt and offer online trainings which offer learners a dynamic and interactive experience. So there are a number of cross-cutting features, elements, when you look at the different modules. And I'll just highlight some of these key features. One is that these modules provide for balance between theory and practice, which is something that is often lacking in institutions of learning when you talk about journalism education. So journalism, in our view, is about doing things, and 70% of the approach in the modules calls for practice, so that at the end of the day, we have journalists that are able to, immediately start running once they enter the newsroom. I remember one of the participants, Sujo Chitete, talked about a newsroom in a classroom, an initiative where he would take people from the sector to at least offer the experiences with journalism students. I think that's based on that gap between institutions of higher learning and industry, which was a good initiative. Now, in our case, we're saying we need more practice so that people are able to be, to start working the moment they enter the newsroom. And secondly, it's a two-way interactive process. So whether it's online or offline, our approach is that the process should be interactive. And this makes learning interesting and attractive and suitable for adults and practicing journalists, which I think is very important. And thirdly, it provides for a mix of methods so that it's actually the methods that at the end of the day are engaging and help the participants also, open up and share their experiences, And fourthly, it provides for team building. Some of the methods actually encourage the participants to work in groups. So by working in groups, it also helps them build team spirit, which I believe is important in a newsroom, but also to share, experiences. They are also people-centered. People-centered, and we believe that journalism is about engaging the people. So if the modules at least help the participants, engage with others, at the end of the day, they'll also be able to engage with the sources and the people that they deal with on a daily basis. Last but not least, they're able to respond to the needs of the sector. So finally, on that point, I would say the modules and trainings make it possible for participants to interact with trainers from other parts of the world, giving them exposure to different cultures and different ways of thinking, thereby opening their minds to new possibilities, which I think is very important for practicing journalists. In conclusion, we believe that MISA Malawi, we believe that media sustainability, as MISA Malawi, we believe that media sustainability partly depends on good journalism education. And good journalism education should prepare an individual to remain relevant in a fast-changing world. And such education, online or offline, should be hands-on, people-centered, and build initiative, curiosity, and flexibility to help the journalists adjust and adapt, which I think in a way we can see, from what Mr. Ntonga talked about yesterday. They've got a group of people who are able to, bang heads and come up with innovative ways of surviving the COVID-19 pandemic. And I believe our modules are also partly addressing this. I rest my case on that point.
Thank you very much, Aubrey, for these insights from Malawi. Are there any questions? Because we've got some minutes before we proceed. I've seen in the chat that Emmanuel has wrote something. Emmanuel, would you like to grab the microphone and repeat your remarks?
Yeah, sure. Sure, I can do that. The first remark is just a remark as it is written. Its relevance of content is very important, but I'm saying it doesn't come cheap because you really have to send people out there into the community, and depending on how big the community is, I've got to be there for some time to gather information and to come up with what the community also would appreciate as relevant, as being relevant to them. Secondly, I'm talking about the training which MISA Malawi and DW are promoting currently, which I think is quite an interesting approach. I've been thinking in the past few months about possibilities of mobile community radios, an idea where you would, because in this approach, you go to a community, you get the community radio guys, you come up with you train them, and then the 70% they're practicing. So you'd go to a community which does not have a community radio, and you have like some mobile kind of community radio yourself, and you pick people from the community and train them. Only that it would have 1 week. You might have to take maybe 2 weeks, 3 weeks. But I was thinking it along that way, so that instead of having community radio established in society permanently, then we would have some moving around and producing programs on the spot in a way. Thank you very much. That's what I was trying to talk about.
Thank you very much for these remarks. Aubrey, would you like to elaborate a little bit on the usage of mobile phones in your trainings?
Yeah, so that was one of the focus areas for the online training, digital storytelling workshop, which was WhatsApp based. We encouraged the participants to actually use mobile phones so that they can report from wherever they are, which was also in a way responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. Because one, there were restrictions in terms of travel, so you could not move around to interview sources and what have you. But if you are able to have the skills to report using your mobile phone, then you can actually still remain relevant wherever you are, whether you're at the office or you're at home, you're moving somewhere, you can still work as a journalist. So that was one of the key areas that we looked at during the digital storytelling WhatsApp module.
Okay, very good.
Omuuonge Uozombuze.
Amaba.